Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jordan Curry, manager with the ERP Solutions Group at GYF. Just want to start out and say, if I look a little red, I'm not nervous. As you guys know, Halloween was on Monday, and I ate all my daughter's candy, so my neck's a little tight, and so that's why my face is red. I'm not nervous, but everybody can calm down and take a breath, relax. We're not going to be talking about any upcoming elections or taxes. We're going to be talking about building a case for an ERP system. So, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys today, and look forward to our presentation.
Thanks, Jordan. And I'm Jim O'Mara, Senior Manager within our ERP Solutions Group. As all the other previous speakers have expressed, it's really a joy, and we're happy to be here again in person versus virtual. So try to make this interesting, and we'll also try to keep it quick, because I know we're preventing you from your next break. So that being said, we'll kind of jump into the agenda and kind of guide you through what we're going to be about to talk through. We'll switch to the next. All right, so as you can see here, what we have prepared to talk to you today is goals of implementing an ERP, but more specifically, once you've made that strategic decision to go through the process of selecting ERP, why should you build a business case? What's the importance behind that? And then from there, how do you actually build it? And specifically, we're going to walk you through detailed steps of building that business case. What are the key process you should follow as part of that process? And then finally, once you have gone through the process of, making that strategic decision to go with a new ERP, and you've gone through the process of business case, how do you then convince your stakeholders? And then a summary of putting it all together, why did you go through all this? Why are you going through a new ERP? Actually, I want to back up real quick. So I did want to pause real quick, and I expect a couple show of hands because I've actually worked with you personally on a few of these things, but real quick show of hands, how many people have actually been part of an ERP implementation, or even if it's not ERP, at least some type of software, whether it's tax, something else. Yeah, quite a few of you, right? But how many of you had the opportunity to actually be part of the business case process, or how many of you were asked to be part of the business case process, or more importantly, how many of you were informed 2 weeks before the go live that you are actually going to be getting a new ERP, right? So the purpose of what we're going through today is to avoid that kind of surprise that you're not the one that's finding out 2 weeks before. It's identifying those key stakeholders up front, involving them in the process, and making sure that the selection process as well as the actual implementation goes as smooth as possible. All right, so as you can see here, our goals of implementing an ERP, so some of the obvious ones, right? Increase productivity. Who doesn't want to be more productive? As Don has alluded to, as well as some of the other presenters that have talked today, there's a talent shortage, right? So it's now is more important than ever that people are more productive at their day-to-day jobs, and they have the right tools in place to be able to do, what they need to do for the core business. Reduce cost. This might seem like a bit of an oxymoron when you're talking about going through a software implementation. You've now got a subscription cost, and you have to pay a third-party vendor to do your implementation. But the point is that we'll stress throughout the presentation is, there is really an opportunity to reduce your costs. So opportunities where you can reduction in staff due to process inefficiencies and automations. Enhance decision making. With a new modern day ERP, your reports are real time. You have KPIs, dashboards that can come pre-configured in your new system. You no longer have to have specialists that are report writers and such a high presence of IT individuals to really get you the reports that you need and want today. And then finally, higher customer satisfaction. And I like to compare this one to, I'll make a corny joke here, happy wife, happy life, right? So, if your customer's not happy, they're going to leave and they're going to go to your next competitor that's offering something similar to you. So there's a real importance, and we've seen a real shift that, it's not so much just the reports and efficiencies you're getting, but it's how can you improve your customer and your interaction with them. So why? So you made a decision that you're going to go through the process and make an investment to go with a new ERP system, but why should you build a business case? Significant investment in time yes. Money, yes. But also the change management aspect that too many people fall short of when they're evaluating a new ERP. This is a huge piece of it, right? Your process is going to change. Imagine someone in the warehouse that is doing a very good job, inventory is accurate, but they're doing it all in Excel. But tomorrow it's going to be in this cloud solution that looks completely different and has restrictions in place, and that certain processes now have to be followed. It's a huge change and undertaking. So the point of that is involving those key people, as I was mentioning at the kickoff, involving them and identifying those stakeholders, getting them involved early on, getting them involved in the selection process so they're not the ones that are just finding out after a selection's been made, or, like I said, 2 weeks or 2 months before the go live that, hey, we're switching systems, my job's going to change. Additionally, it gives the organization, as you can see, a tool or a metric to measure against, right? So a hard facts, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. It's dollar amounts, benefits that you're getting, but it's also qualitative. As I mentioned, customer satisfaction, and among other things, employee satisfaction. They're no longer doing manual processes, living in Excel, doing things, manipulating of data. They can do more in one consolidated system. So it's a reason why you should build this business case and add a lot of value to eventually selecting the right tool and making your project successful. So now you determine the why. How do you begin to put that together? Maybe it's your first time, or maybe you've been through many of these, but how do you go through approaching building the business case? So as I mentioned, establishing that project team, right? Identifying those key stakeholders, but also just as importantly is who's your executive sponsor? Too many times Jordan and I work on projects and the business process owners are great, but there's not the key owner at the top that can make those, we have challenges on a change order or a direction scope or a customization that may or may not be needed. Like, who is that top level that can make that decision and keep things on track? Too often it's not the case, it's lacking. So identifying that project sponsor up front.
In ERP implementations today, oftentimes there's a couple different ways to do the same thing. And a lot of times it's not exactly clear which way will end up being the best for your business. Obviously you can do a significant amount of testing, but eventually you do need to decide and move forward. And having an executive sponsor really helps, kind of keep the ball moving, keep the project. And that's really true not only for an ERP system, but really any project. You could do a significant amount of testing, but you need to make sure that there's who the decision makers are. Because like Jim said, too often that's something that can really hold up an implementation.
So in addition to identifying who those key stakeholders are and having that executive sponsor identified, use help, use your resources that are available to you, whether it's an external consultant or maybe you're at fortunate enough to work at a company that you have that internal bandwidth with a skill set of people who know how to document business requirements, do a software evaluation and selection. But if not, there's plenty of consultants and other means necessary to help you without this process. And then finally, to reiterate what we talked about in the previous slide, make it a numbers-based analysis. I think that speaks to many of the accountants of us in the room that we want to see facts. We want to see numbers. Why is this a good decision to go with a new ERP? It's not always about the dollar amount though, right? As we've been saying, there's qualitative reasons, but having those hard-pressed facts, really helps those key decision makers, have the case and make this project selection go forward. So in this slide, kind of outlines a picture of where we're going to be spending the meat of our presentation. It's really the 7 key critical steps to building an ERP business case. So the first one is identifying and analyzing your current issues. So how did you get here? Why are you in the process? Why are you thinking about converting to a new ERP? What problems am I trying to solve? What inefficiencies, what costs am I trying to get rid of? What's changed my business that requires a new modern system? Then, once you've kind of identified what are my challenges, what are the benefits that a new ERP is going to bring to me? Is it just those problems, or is it other things? Is it mobility, the ability to use your phone to do a lot of things, approving journal entries that you couldn't do in a legacy system? So once you've kind of analyzed how an ERP can help, then you get to the process of actually going through a project to make your selection, right? So how do you evaluate the different ERP solutions that are out there to make sure the right one is for you? This is both, which ones offer the best package in terms of modules, but also the best way of how it's going to be hosted, whether, on-site or in the cloud or some type of hybrid model. once you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 of who the ERPs you want to go with, the vendors you want to work with, then you go into a detailed process of estimating your costs. And this is really where the business case really starts to come into play, right? It's the cost of the software itself, the licenses, the users, and everything else, but also to keep in mind, we'll go this in greater detail, what is the cost of your actual implementation? And, including that final picture, that full picture to your stakeholders is huge. And finally, now that you've selected or close to selecting and you have those costs, building that ROI that we've been continuing to stress throughout these slides. What do those metrics look like? What are those hard facts and what are those qualitative ones? And how do you present that in a way that management, leadership, your investors, and everyone else that's your interested parties are ready to make that decision?
Yeah, and then 6 and 7, the next steps are really important for having a successful ERP implementation. If you don't really drive 6 and 7 home, then all the work that you've done beforehand, it really could go to waste. Essentially, you need to have a strong implementation plan moving forward. So identify implementation risks. So really look at what are the possibilities that could go wrong or derail the ERP project and put a plan in place to mitigate that. Is it the right time? Do we have competing priorities? Identify those things up front, put in a plan to lessen the effect of those risks. Create a high-level implementation plan. So, at this stage in the game, you're probably not going to be able to get so detailed into a project plan, but at least show the main stakeholders in the project a path to a successful ERP implementation. Allocate time for them to, apply appropriate resources, in their, staff, whoever needs to be involved with the implementation, make sure they have enough time to do that. Don't, take for granted that step. Really show the stakeholders. A lot of times in ERP implementation, Jim asked who all has been involved in one. It can seem intimidating, but it really doesn't have to be. Show a plan for a successful implementation. Make it easy. Show a phased approach of the implementation. You don't have to bite it all off at once. You don't have to do the whole thing at once. You can take a phased approach.
Right. So going in kind of details of those different steps for in that pie chart you saw. So the first one is identifying and analyzing your current issues, as we were saying. So these are just some of the common issues that a lot of companies are realizing when they're making that decision, right? Costly process inefficiencies. Why am I doing 10 manual processes for something that can be automated in a new modern system? Obstacles to growth. This one really sticks out. We can't tell you how many times that, as we're working with prospects that, hopefully usually become customers is, what are they doing? They have, 3 different sets of QuickBooks for their 3 different entities due to acquisition activity that they have going on. They're extracting all that every month and then having to do their own consolidation in Excel. And so, how does that make you able to grow and keep that going? You don't want 6 different ERP systems, 6 different QuickBooks in a Sage hanging out there, right? By being on a modern day ERP where you can quickly bring those acquisitions on, be able to report on them and get them up and running functionally brings a lot of value. So obstacles to growth is a huge one that we see. Inability to meet customer expectations. We continue to talk about this one, but the big thing is it's competitive out there now, right? There's been a lot of consolidation of all the different industries and the companies that are out there. So if you're not one of the ones that are meeting those customer demands, whether it's as ease of allowing a customer to pay your invoice online versus having to send an ACH to your bank, right? Does your modern system today, does it have a link on your invoice where you can log right in and pay that bill? If not, I don't know, are you missing a step, or are customers going to question the way that they're doing things with you? And then other things we've talked about already, lack of real-time decision making. And then also cost of your existing system, which we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about the different benefits of on-prem versus cloud in a different slide. So analyzing the benefits of the ERP. So now that you've kind of documented what are your challenges, what are the benefits I'm going to get? Why do I want to go through this? What are the benefits that are going to be brought to me? You know, you should be building. Oh, I almost went into yours. Oh, this is you. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, really, you know, when analyzing an ERP system, you want to make a list of achievable goals. In order to be achievable, they have to be specific, measurable, and realistic. So, you know, I mentioned previously, don't bite off more than you can chew initially. Take a phased approach. Oftentimes, we found that is a better approach. If you try to take on too much at once, you're not going to get the fundamentals sound. You got to get the fundamentals sound first, so then you can move on to the more complex processes within the ERP system. So we talk about some specific examples. You know, one that comes up very often is reduce the time it takes for your month-end close process. So there's been examples in the past where there's a very lengthy process to reconcile a particular accrued purchases account. You know, goods received, goods paid, accrued purchases. So ERP systems now basically do that reconciliations for you based on what has been received and what has been paid. So consider the time it takes an individual to put that reconciliation together. And if they didn't have to spend the time in Excel putting that together, what could they be doing? What are you missing because they're spending time just worried about getting the data completed, not really analyzing the data? Another example is, you know, increase the number of transactions that a user is able to put into the system. We all talk about automation with technology. You know, automation is increasing. Like I said, with the phased approach, sometimes you want to limit that initially. You want to make sure that the business process is correct before you automate anything. But the technology, take use of that. Use it to your advantage. You're able to automate a lot of processes now that can really help efficiency. And like I said, turn your employees, empower them to not just be data entry, but to really analyze transactions, really look for, measure completeness. Another example, reduce inaccurate orders by 25% within the first 6 months of the implementation. So, if you have a problem with inaccuracies in the orders being entered into the system, wrong item, inaccurate shipping address, things of that nature, have an approval process on the orders that are being entered. Maybe you have the newer software is able to integrate with an EDI. So it kind of, again, automates some of that thing. So you can reduce errors, reduce problems, again, leading to, happier customers, and ultimately, happier employees, more efficient process. Obviously that'll make their life easier. So. Okay, so just some continued examples, some obvious examples of an ERP, the benefits that you want to look for in our ERP when you're, after you have developed, we're talking about a business requirement document. You want to have crystal clear what your requirements are. As long as you know what your requirements are, that, you really want to understand that before you go into a project like this. So obviously we'll be looking for greater efficiency and productivity, optimize inventory levels, so have an accurate picture of your inventory. Inventory is being recorded real time. You're getting a good picture into your inventory levels, what's coming down the pike from a demand perspective, what's going to be required from a procurement perspective. Better cash flow predictions, so you have all your payables, you have all your receivables, so that there's a lot of reporting now available in ERP systems that can give you a good short-term prediction of your cash flow needs. Improve customer service. We do this, file a case. Ultimately we see that the quicker that you're hearing a customer request and getting back to them, the better it's going to be ultimately. That's a very important thing from a business perspective. So having a way to track that within a system rather than it be in somebody's inbox tends to be a really good thing. Like I talked about, higher employee satisfaction. You give them a better process. Ultimately, if they don't have to spend a good amount of time doing data entry or in Excel, that's going to lead to a happier employee. Better workforce management, onboarding processes. So when you're onboarding a new employee, making sure each step that needs to occur does occur in the system. You can have a workflow for that. Better decision making. So with the real-time data, having the data available, not in a bunch of different systems, a bunch of different places, you're able to relate the data and then make better decisions to quickly adapt to problems that are arising, or basically make decisions quicker. So these are all things that, based on what Jim talked about, when you analyze current problems, these are examples of some of the obvious benefits that you'll be looking for in an ERP system. And the technology is out there. It's really improving. So you'll be able to get these benefits out of an ERP.
So this next graphic we thought was pretty interesting. As you can see, as the time goes on, that how priorities are changing. And something that really stuck out to me, and Jordan's going to share some of his thoughts as well, is the fact that the area for savings actually became less and less of a priority as time and time got closer to where we are today. So it became less of a stress on how much am I going to save by doing implementation, and then shifted to, on this last pillar here, it's more of a strategic investment. And that kind of alludes to what I was saying earlier about these companies that are doing all these acquisitions and having to bring on people quickly. You need a ERP system that can quickly onboard these new subsidiaries, get their trial balances in, and operate as quickly as possible as you continue to grow, keep acquiring, right? So I thought that was a really interesting trend as we were kind of putting this together, that it's not always about cost reduction. It's about where is it going to take us from here.
Another point I noticed, this timeline here is right when COVID started through the fall of 2020, and what scored the highest out of anything overall throughout the 4 seasons there is to use the data more effectively. So where is the data? How can you use the data to better your business? Obviously, there's with COVID, the new world, everybody's working remotely now. So having easy access to your data is obviously very important. But also, how can you use your data more effectively? How can you report on your data rather than, like I said, developing a lot of manual reporting? Put your data in a place where you're able to easily get it, easily report on it. So.
All right. So now that you've gone through the process of documenting what your current issues are and what benefits an ERP can bring to you, now how do you talk about which ERP is the right one? Which one is going to bring you all those benefits that you're looking for? They're going to solve those problems, right? So as we've been stressing throughout the presentation, that starts with involving the key stakeholders. It's not bringing them in last minute for training and saying, here's your new system, right? It's involving them up front, who are the ones that are going to gain the most, but also who are the ones that are going to suffer the most if this implementation or the software that's selected, goes awry. So, it's critical to involve those team members up front. So when you're going through then that evaluation process, which ERPs, which modules do you need? It's changed the way that software is selected now and the way pricing works, right? Especially for those cloud solutions. Like every module kind of has its own price, and as you continue to add on modules as your company grows or additional functionality is required, it's a whole nother subscription that you're adding and coming into it. So doing that due diligence up front, making sure you get all those modules that you're looking for, what those costs are, as well as the cost of what a full user license is a key picture as you're doing this evaluation and really weighing that. And that's going to play a huge factor into your next step when you put together the ROI. But also, all systems have, a lot of the same features. So then if you're down to these 3 that you want, which way do you want to have that system? Depending on what your business is, you might have a need for doing it on premise. There might be security concerns. You might have a contract with the government. I don't know if there's any, government contractors in here, but, that data can't be touched by offshore employee data, right? So that you can't have, people in Ireland touching your data and resolving issues when you're having issues or defects in your system, right? So sometimes there really is a business case, and part of that this process go through is determining, cloud or on-premise. And we're going to talk to a couple, pros and cons of, those different ones in just a second here.
Okay. So before I start this slide, I got to ask, is there any IT people in the room? I just want to make sure I ask that before I get started here, because I don't want to get tackled if I misstep or offend anybody with this, because this tends to be a little bit of a heated area sometimes, depending on what the current infrastructure is. But for the cloud-based ERP versus an on-premise ERP, my favorite example, very simple example, is going to a restaurant versus eating at home. It's very simple example, but it applies nicely to this. Now, I'm not suggesting for either one of them, and I'm certainly not suggesting to eat out every night, but it is a good example for this case. So cloud-based ERP, obviously it's a software as a service. So part of that service is they are responsible for storing your data, securing your data, the overall IT infrastructure of the ERP system. That is all what you're paying for as part of that service. So when you log on to the ERP system, your data is there and available for you to use. On the contrary to that is an on-premise ERP system. So that some of the benefits for an on-premise ERP system is security. You know exactly if it's housed internally, your data is sitting on your servers. Like Jim mentioned, a lot of times there's compliance issues that it's important to understand. The contracts that you're engaged in, any requirements for that up front. That's when we talk about requirements, that's a big requirement to know up front. But like eating at home, you have to make the food. Hopefully you guys are good cooks. But you have to have the stove. Okay, you have to have the silverware. You have to clean it up after you're done. Same thing with an on-premise ERP. Everything that we talked about with the cloud is now internal. You have to rely on your internal staff for a lot of that. And again, there's benefits to both. I'm not advocating for either one right now, but just some things to consider. Scalability is something to consider, because as you continue to grow, so does the on-premise ERP, where sometimes a cloud-based ERP is easy to roll out as you continue to grow. So it's a good area to consider. Obviously involve your IT department. Hopefully I didn't offend any IT people by this slide, but it's a big consideration when doing an ERP system today. So.
All right, so now that you've documented your concerns, what the ERP is going to bring you, you evaluated, hopefully you're at the point where you're down to 1 or 2, or maybe you are at the 1. How do you put together, and the key word on this first sentence here is an accurate estimate, not the number that you know is going to get approved so that you can get onto a new system because you're tired of using QuickBooks. It's what's an accurate number of what this is going to cost. And to start with that, right, it's what I was alluding to in the previous slide, it's what's the module? What are you going with? How many modules are necessary for now versus how many can be brought in when you're down the road, you're a little bit mature, you have historical data in there. What makes sense now versus later because of that subscription And the way that cloud software works now, it's a watermark, right? So once you sign up for that module, it's now yours until you get to your next renewal. So pricing that out, being realistic, and putting a lot of thought behind the order and what modules are really required for it is going to help you go a long way to getting that total cost of ownership of doing this implementation. But more specifically, the software itself. Whereas, it's a little bit different on the on-premise, right? As many of you would know, if you had on-premise or are still on-premise, right? It's the cost that Jordan was alluding to. You're paying for, maybe you're having to buy a new server because of the new ERP requires that. So those are just, think about it. What are the pros and cons of doing both? And if the software you selected only has one, then I guess, that's kind of your answer. But it's putting together that accurate picture that, is the true cost that's going to be very critical. And in step 5, which is coming up, how do you really evaluate that ROI and not something that's just going to, please your stakeholder. So on top of the subscription and or the software licensing, if doing on-prem, how do you accurately put together what's the implementation going to cost, right? There's a lot of considerations that go into what the overall implementation is going to cost. And it's just it's important for the business as it is the vendor that you're working with to come to agreement and on scoping this out appropriately. Typically, this is broken out into your standard software configuration and deployment. What is the recommended for your industry best? But then the second one we really want to call out because process redesign or customizations, these can be project killers, or if not project killers, project cost enablers. How important is that customization? Where can you not use an out of the box solution or process that software, this new shiny software that you're paying for, can use? Is it really worth it? Maybe it is. A lot of times it can be. We've done some incredible customizations based on a very niche industry that a customer or customers have worked in, and that's fine. But the point is that you get hard numbers on what that's going to take up front, and you make sure you include that in your overall budget and estimate. Data migration, right? This is everyone's favorite. Now, this is an opportunity that you can save a lot of money if the client takes it over, and you're willing, you're able, you have the time, the capability to migrate your data yourself. But sometimes you don't, and you rely on a third-party consultant to help with that. And this is where budgets can be exceeded, sometimes not. But based on that whole process of extracting the data, cleansing it, getting it ready for the new system, and understanding what all that is. So highly recommend as you're going through this, challenge your vendor to explain more of that. Have them share templates with you as you're going through the selection process. See which ones really give you that kind of information, so you're best prepared. For putting together that total cost of ownership of this implementation. Report writing, another one. People love their customer reports, especially on old systems that have been in place for 20, 30 years, right? People get so tied to them, but keep an open mind. What's required for day one versus what can be built later on in a BI environment, or even most of the new modern day ERP systems have their own analytical tools built in. You can get there. Just be open mind. You don't have to request 20 customer reports, right? And then training. I think you were at a point here.
Yeah. So training, very important. When bringing on a new ERP system, when we do an implementation, we always say up front, it's very important to have your administrator, system administrator, identified early. That way, that individual can start preparing themselves for that role, getting familiar with the system. So throughout the implementation, they're able to see kind of how the system's designed, how the system's configured, and then moving forward can sustain the system internally. So it's never, obviously you want a good partner that can support you throughout the life of your ERP system using it, but you don't want to be reliant on anybody for any third parties or anything like that for your day-to-day operations or to make a modification within the system. You want to empower somebody internally to make those changes. In today's day and age with the ERP systems, contrary to prior, there's not a lot of coding involved or back office scripts. It's really point and click configuration. So you just need to be familiar with the system, familiar with the impacts, particularly on the financials, as we all know. to do these changes. So you want to invest in the training of whoever's going to be your administrator to make sure they're equipped moving forward to support the system internally. People that have done that, it's been a huge benefit to them.
So now that you're in the part of your journey where you're preparing, you've got those kind of final costs or close to those final costs, you've got the software, you've realized all the benefits. Now comes the time to put the road meets the rubber, right? Here's where you put in your business case the ROI. You know exactly what's going to cost. Now you got to quantify and qualify, what are the benefits to really prove your point to your stakeholders, to your management team to make that selection, right? And so some of those are easy, tangible ones that are hard, fast numbers. I'm going to reduce cost by X, by having a more efficient process or an automated process that I wasn't able to do or didn't have the capabilities to do in an old, legacy system. Increased revenue. How am I going to increase revenue in, a new ERP? Well, maybe it's because in my old system, it takes me 2 days to manually generate all these invoices and get them manually sent out to all my customers. Whereas in a modern day system, you can set up billing schedules where it automatically creates the invoice based on logic and will automatically send it to your customers on your behalf based on email addresses that are saved on the customer master data. Huge opportunity to get your invoices out faster and ultimately get paid faster, right? But then there's less tangible ones that we've been talking through, customer satisfaction, employee retention and things, but won't continue to beat that one too much. But more importantly, as we continue to stress this final bullet, the analysis, how do you show that and what is the true cost, what's being reduced, and what are those numbers? And to continue on that, it will change. A couple things we wanted to highlight. So this first bullet is kind of going over things that we've continued to stress throughout, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but cost savings, better metrics, improve. But the two things that stuck out to me are more bullet points 2 and 3. Interesting that the average ROI time to get your investment back is 2.5 years. So you're making this large time effort, money effort, to make a software selection, to go through the pain, sometimes not, of going through a new ERP implementation. But I think it's light at the end of the tunnel knowing that, if you've done right, the right software was selected, the right vendor was chosen, you really can realize those benefits in pretty short term. So that, that really stuck out. And then another interesting one, because, we're in continual conversations all the time as we're talking to our customers or prospects that are looking to upgrade and move on to a new ERP, like how much should I be paying for a subscription in an implementation, right? There is no magic answer, right? It depends on your industry and those customizations I was alluding to. But as a data point, interesting, for a mid-sized company, so those that are under $1 billion in revenue per year, the cost of ownership should, and this includes your maintenance and ongoing of your staff, but the cost of ownership should be around 3 to 5% of your annual revenue versus a 1 to 2%, if you're a larger, publicly traded or over $1 billion a year company. So.
Okay, so identifying the risks as part of building your ERP business case. So, some of the obvious risks, poor project management. So having communication early and often is always a good thing as part of an implementation. So you want to make sure everybody's involved, nobody's going dark, everybody's aware of what's coming down the pike. Very important as part of the project. Inability to manage the costs in the duration of the project is a big one. That's why, like we're talking about, knowing your requirements is a huge part of that. So having a good business requirement document prior to even starting the implementation is important. So then day one, what the processes are that need to be achieved moving forward. Internal resistance to new systems. Has anybody been that person before? Anybody? You're lying, probably. The person that says, we used to do it this way, why are we doing this? It is all around bad for the implementation. So there needs to be, that's part of identifying that executive sponsor to kind of set a precedent and say, this is the way we're going. You chose to invest money in the system, get your business on the system. Naysayers are ultimately gonna hurt the success of the new system. So they need to understand that this is the way it's going, and again, work to mitigate that risk. Mitigate having naysayers. And again, I'm not saying, a lot of times they're very valid concerns that they have. So you really want to pay attention to that. Make sure you put in a plan to capture that requirement. Software integration issues, APIs are very important in today's day and age. Making sure that all the systems that you use, if they're going to exist in your new structure, that you have a way to integrate it if that is needed. And then poor data quality. So having duplicate records, not having a clear item master, having a huge item master with not a lot of clarity of why. Those things really can be cleaned up the moment you're going to be doing an ERP implementation. Okay, so just to continue with the implementation risks, it's just, again, I'm going to highlight, this is why it's very important to know your requirements. I'll skip right down to the bullet at the bottom. 65% of implementations, system modifications needed to improve the usability of the system. So customizations were needed. And when I say customizations, a lot of times it's a custom record, something like that, not really a script of that nature, but just a modification of the native system to meet the requirement. So that's why it's very important to know what the key data points are for your business, know where they need to be captured in the order-to-cash process or the procure-to-pay process, and present that up front as part of the implementation. Because if you get into the project and you hit that and don't kind of already have a plan for that, a lot of times that'll need additional scoping and cause some time lags in the project. So it's important to understand what that is up front. Okay, so create a high-level implementation plan, like I talked about before. When building an initial business case, you're not going to want to get too detailed because, as we know, plans can change. But you do want to show that high-level roadmap. Usually a good high-level roadmap for a project is you have the discovery and planning phase. Part of that is building an ERP business case. So, discovering, making sure that, the software that you're going to be selecting is going to meet your requirements. It has the ability to meet all of your key requirements. Design, so that's when you get into the implementation. The design phase is, taking your business process and mapping that to the ERP. Like we talked about before, we always want to adhere to best practice within the system, stick to the native process within the system. But like I said, 65% of the time, there's a area where you need to go a little bit farther that will really help out a process, a business process. So that's one of the great advantages of ERP systems today. You have the ability to really change the native process to fit your business. Development, so actually taking the design and implementing it into the system. Very key point, testing. So a lot of times, you set a date for a go live, and you work towards that date. A lot of times what ends up happening is testing gets squeezed, the testing time frame gets squeezed, and you don't allow enough time for that. So you want to make sure that you build in enough time for adequate testing to make sure that, day one, the process from a overall GL perspective and overall requirement perspective is going to meet your business needs. And then deployment, obviously the cutover, and then ongoing support as you move forward. So, Jimmy.
All right, and wrapping things up, as I believe we have 5 or so more minutes that are holding you guys from your break, is, now that you've gone through that whole journey that we've walked you through, how do you convince your stakeholders? And ultimately, it's, everything we've been talking about. It's those hard facts. What are those benefits? What are those ultimate costs? But more importantly, I think it's more bullet point 2, and it's, what are those stakeholders' needs, and how are you, each one's important to the overall selection. A salesperson's requirements can be much different than a warehouse or inventory manager versus, a lot of what your requirements would be for the people sitting in this room. But the easiest way to collect those requirements is kind of what we're stressing from the very beginning. It's, involve those people, have them as part of the project team, as part of that selection process, as part of that, that overall champion, so they're not the ones being surprised. Then, there is no surprise when that software is selected and that's what you're going with. They were involved in that decision. It really reduces the people, the naysayers, the ones who don't want to change their job, they were involved up front and they're part of this. So that's what I think is, that's the biggest way to convince them, is involve them and get those true costs. And the why should you replace your ERP system? I mean, I think it's the obvious that we've been stressing. It's all those benefits that we're documenting that we went through, right? It's what value is it bringing to your organization? What value is it bringing to your investors? What value is it bringing to your employees who are having to use it every day? And then ultimately, what values you bringing to your customers, and ultimately where this all began at number 1, what problems is it going to solve? That's why you're going through this process, this long process and costly process at times to really upgrade into a new system. And then finally, just as some key takeaways, right? This is a very strategic, costly process, right? So remember to always analyze the issues, accurate costs. What are all those benefits? Explore ERP implementations case studies. Do your research. There's so much literature and documentation out there now that gives you all the benefits. There's vendors you can talk to that aren't going to charge you, a free consultation. There's Gartner subscriptions that, probably many of you are aware of that, list out, these are the 10 you should start with and narrow it down from there, right? And then, and finally, developing that implementation plan. Once you've made that decision, you've signed up, you signed on the dotted line, you're paying for that subscription. Make sure you have a plan so that you don't fail.
Yeah, and if you're or someone that has considered doing an ERP implementation and maybe you haven't for whatever reason, just consider what we talked about today. Not just the overall building of a business case, but consider the time that is being spent on manual process. Consider what is being left on the table. Again, the trend that we're seeing is empowering employees to not just enter the data, a lot of manual entry or reconciliations in Excel, but to actually analyze, buy into what it is you're doing. Buy into the process. You give them a tool that they're able to really meet your business requirement. We've seen that really benefit them. So really consider, what areas of your business, you're able to solve with newer technology, with an ERP system. Yeah. So any questions for Jim or I today? I'd love to. Hopefully there's no IT people that are going to question me about the cloud versus on-prem or challenge me on that. Because that'll be...
All right. As promised, your break. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you very much.